So in 2001, the Australian government looked at this completely submerged coral reef out in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Right, literally just coral and sand.
Yeah, exactly. A reef with zero buildings, no docks, no cranes, and definitely no permanent human inhabitants. And they decided to legally declare it a fully functioning proclaimed port.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. I mean, they didn't build anything new. They simply, rewrote the legal reality of a physical space to completely alter the rules of global migration.
Yeah?
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are bringing you into this intensely high-stakes intersection of extreme geography, human desperation, and, well, maritime law.
It's a really complex mix.
It really is. And our focus today is the vast, unforgiving northern coastline of Australia. Specifically, you're looking at the stretch spanning from Kuri Bay in Western Australia all the way across to Port Essington in the Northern Territory.
And, it's a region that really forces us to completely decouple the concept of a border from, like, the traditional image of a line on a map.
Right, like a checkpoint with gates and guards.
Exactly. The sources we are working from today, which stem from a highly detailed informational exchange with an AI regarding maritime arrivals, border protection policies, and people smuggling dynamics, they paint a picture of a border that is just this shifting, almost unimaginable puzzle of ocean currents, mangrove swamps, and, as you mentioned, legal fictions.
Yeah, the legal fictions part is fascinating. But before we really get into the mechanics of those, we need to establish our mandate for this deep dive.
Good point.
Because, we're dealing with border security and asylum policies here, which are intensely charged topics across the entire global political spectrum.
Very much so.
So we are examining the raw source material to understand the historical policies, the physical realities of these crossings, and the legal framework as they actually occurred. We aren't here to litigate the morality of these policies, right?
No, not at all.
Or endorse any particular political viewpoint. Our mission is strictly forensic. We just want to unpack how this border operates, the tactics used by smugglers, and the legal mechanisms deployed by the state, entirely impartially.
And I think the mechanics alone are complex enough without even adding those ideological layers. I mean, to grasp why a government would resort to legally redefining a coral reef, we first have to understand the sheer scale and the hostility of the physical canvas they were trying to secure.
Yeah, the geography is just immense.
It is. When we talk about the stretch from Kuri Bay to Port Essington, we are talking about a geographical anomaly.
And the sources are very specific about those two anchor points. So Kuri Bay is in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, right? Like about 330 kilometers north of Broome.
That's right.
And then Port Essington is way over in the Northern Territory on the Coburg Peninsula. So between them lies just thousands of kilometers of absolute wilderness. But Kuri Bay itself, it isn't a port in the traditional sense, is it?
Oh, no, far from it.
Like, it's not a logistical hub where you'd expect an international arrival.
No, Kuri Bay is actually a remote pearl farming and tourism site. It is profoundly isolated.
Wow.
Yeah, and as you track east from there, you hit the Bonaparte Archipelago and eventually the remote islands of the Northern Territory, like the TV Islands.
And those sit about 80 to 100 kilometers north of Darwin.
Yeah, exactly. And Darwin is really the only major population center anywhere near this entire zone. The coastline itself, I mean, it's defined by intricate, impenetrable mangrove swamps, sheer cliff faces, and some of the most extreme tidal movements on the planet.
Right, the sources mention that. The Kimberley coast experiences tidal variations of up to 11 meters.
11 meters. Let that sink in.
I mean, so the coastline is literally expanding and contracting by miles every single day.
Yes, and creating massive horizontal waterfalls and whirlpools in the process.
It's like trying to secure a border that isn't a neat fence, but thousands of miles of unpredictable, deadly wilderness. It's less like Border Patrol and more like trying to monitor the edge of a hostile alien planet for you guys.
That is a perfect way to describe it. Add to that the seasonal monsoons, which bring cyclonic winds and wildly unpredictable weather patterns, and you have an environment that is actively, fiercely hostile to any kind of maritime navigation.
Which, raises an immediate strategic question for you to consider as you're listening to this. If I am operating a smuggling syndicate, or, if I am an asylum seeker navigating a vessel, why aim for the absolute most dangerous, isolated stretch of wilderness?
That's a great question.
Like, why not navigate towards Darwin or another commercial hub where there is immediate infrastructure, deeper channels, safer harborage, Aiming for a cliff face with an 11-meter tide just seems suicidal.
Well, the logic entirely flips when the primary objective isn't finding a safe harbor, but simply making physical contact with sovereign territory before detection.
Oh, great.
Right? The operational goal of an irregular maritime vessel, or IMV as they're called, is explicitly to avoid major commercial ports and shipping lanes.
Because of the surveillance?
Exactly. Those zones are heavily monitored by radar, Coast Guard vessels, and just general commercial traffic. The isolated stretches of the Kimberley coast, or the Tiwi Islands, they're targeted precisely because they're off of the very first land masses encountered when a vessel is traveling south.
South across the Timor or Arafura Seas from Indonesia, right?
You got it, from the Indonesian archipelago.
So it's a pure distance calculation. You just want the shortest possible exposure time on the open ocean?
That's the entire strategic imperative. I mean, every additional hour on the water, especially if you try to skirt the coast down to a major port like Darwin, it exponentially increases the probability of detection by the Australian Border Force.
Right.
So the smugglers, they're optimizing for the shortest route to landfall, regardless of how hostile that specific landfall might actually be.
So the geography essentially dictates the trajectory, pushing arrivals to the absolute fringes of the continent. But if they are crossing the Timor Sea, dealing with those insane currents and monsoonal swells, we really have to look at the engineering of the vessels themselves. And the source material gets incredibly dark here when it details the anatomy of what the government classifies as a SIV.
Right, a suspected illegal entry vessel.
Yeah. I mean, these aren't deep sea trawlers we're talking about.
Not at all. They are almost entirely unsuited for the open ocean. The baseline vessel utilized in these operations is typically a very small, traditional wooden fishing boat.
Often sourced from local fleets in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, exactly. And these craft, they are engineered with very shallow drafts, specifically designed for near-shore, coastal fishing in relatively calm waters.
So they don't have the keels for the ocean.
No, they do not have the keels or the structural integrity required to handle the deep-water swells and the aggressive wave frequencies of the open ocean.
Okay, let's break down the physics of that for a second. If you take a shallow draft wooden boat designed for coastal reefs and you put it in a massive monsoonal swell, what happens to the stability? I'm assuming the metacentric height, the distance between the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy is already pretty marginal on these boats.
Oh, the stability is completely compromised before they even leave the shore.
Really? Before they even leave?
Yeah, because of the brutal economics of the smuggling operation.
Yeah.
The smugglers intentionally, and I mean severely, overload these vessels.
Right.
So a wooden boat that's engineered to hold a crew of maybe, 10 fishermen, it will be loaded with 50, 80, or sometimes over 100 passengers.
Wow. Which drastically shifts the center of gravity upward.
Making it incredibly top-heavy.
And if you have a shallow draft, you just don't have the counterbalance below the waterline to prevent a roll, right?
Exactly. You don't have the ballast. And then you have to add in the free surface effect.
What is that?
Well, when these boats inevitably take on water, because remember, they lack proper sealing or functioning bilge pumps, that water just sloshes back and forth across the deck or in the hold with every single wave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this shifting mass of water further destabilizes an already overloaded top-heavy vessel. A single rogue wave or even just a sudden shift in wind direction can induce a fatal capsize.
That is terrifying. And the mechanical propulsion is just as compromised, isn't it? Because the sources note frequent, almost inevitable engine failures on these trips.
Yeah, the engines in these SIEs are often just repurposed truck or agricultural engines that have been literally jury-rigged into the hull.
Like tractor engines.
Pretty much. They completely lack marine-grade cooling systems.
Mm-hmm.
So when they are pushed to their absolute limits, chugging across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean, the saltwater corrosion and overheating lead to catastrophic engine failure.
It's just a matter of time.
It really is. Furthermore, they are essentially running blind. These vessels severely lack modern navigational equipment.
No GPS.
Rarely. We are talking about captains relying on very basic compasses or visual reckoning, completely devoid of long-range maritime radar or redundant communication arrays.
So if you're listening, think about this tragedy. You have a top-heavy, structurally inappropriate wooden boat powered by a dying tractor engine navigating blind into 11-meter tides. I mean, the smugglers obviously know the failure rate is astronomical here.
They do?
So if the business model relies on delivering the passengers to the destination, how does this level of risk make economic sense for the syndicates? Surely a sunken boat destroys their reputation and their future revenue.
Well, you're applying a conventional business logic to an illicit, highly asymmetric market.
Okay, fair enough.
The smugglers, they operate on sheer volume and upfront payment. The profit margin per head on a severely overloaded vessel vastly outweighs the capital cost of the vessel itself.
Because the boat is basically worthless.
Exactly. It's often a derelict or end-of-life fishing boat bought for a fraction of the cost of a seaworthy ship. If a vessel is intercepted or tragically lost at sea, the financial loss to the syndicate is minimal compared to the revenue they've already collected.
So the very tools used to make this journey are fundamentally designed to fail. The smugglers aren't selling safe passage. They're selling a high-stakes gamble against the ocean. The vessel is entirely disposable.
Completely disposable, and their tactics evolve rapidly based on the perceived threat matrix. The sources really highlight a continuous cat-and-mouse game between the smugglers and border enforcement.
Right.
When the Australian government heavily publicizes its interception capabilities, increasing the perceived risk, the syndicates, they don't invest in safer boats. They go the exact opposite direction.
They shift to smaller boats.
Yes, smaller, even less conspicuous craft.
Because smaller boats have a lower radar cross-section, right? They're harder to spot.
Exactly. A small wooden hull sitting super low in the water is incredibly difficult to distinguish from ambient sea clutter on a radar screen.
This looks like a wave.
Exactly. But of course, that evasion tactic makes the journey exponentially more lethal for the passengers. Conversely, if the syndicates perceive a lull in enforcement, they might scale up to larger vessels to move more volume, but those larger vessels remain rudimentary, poorly maintained, and fundamentally unsafe.
So safety is just never a variable in their operational calculus.
Never. It is strictly an algorithm of evasion versus capacity.
Which brings us to the surveillance net itself. Australia operates some of the most sophisticated over-the-horizon radar systems in the world, right? Like the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, alongside intense aerial and satellite surveillance.
Yes, JRNA is a massive piece of infrastructure.
But the source material is explicit. Technology fails here. Despite the billions and billions spent on maritime domain awareness, boats still occasionally slip through and make landfall. How is that even possible in the modern era?
Well, it comes down to the limitations of physics and the sheer mind-boggling scale of the geography. Radar systems, even incredibly advanced ones like JORN, they rely on bouncing electromagnetic waves off a target.
Right.
Wooden boats, especially waterlogged ones sitting really low in heavy swells, they simply do not provide a strong reflective signature.
The radar just passes right through them or bounces off the waves instead.
Exactly. And satellites, they are constrained by revisit rates and cloud cover. You can't have a high-resolution optical satellite continuously staring at every single square meter of a 1,000-kilometer coastline.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The technology provides a probabilistic net, not an absolute impenetrable shield.
Okay, so when the multi-billion-dollar technological shield inevitably has a gap, who actually catches the anomaly? It's not necessarily a border force cutter just waiting in the mangroves, is it?
Usually not.
The sources introduce this incredibly vital human element, what they call the eyes and ears of the coast.
Yeah, because the coastline is so vast and so deeply isolated, the initial detection of an irregular arrival frequently falls to people completely unconnected to border enforcement.
Regular civilians.
Exactly. We are talking about workers on massive cattle stations, remote tourism charter operators, and, crucially, Indigenous rangers.
I mean, the scale of those cattle stations is hard to even wrap your head around. Some of them in the Northern Territory and Western Australia are literally the size of small European countries.
They are massive.
You could have a single worker out checking fence lines by helicopter or a dirt bike hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town.
And that extreme isolation means that if a SEV manages to ground itself on a remote beach, that cattle worker is suddenly out of nowhere the first responder to an international maritime incident.
That is just surreal.
It really is. But the role of Indigenous ranger groups is particularly emphasized in the source material as being critical here. These groups are actively managing the land and the coastline, and they possess a deep ancestral connection to what is officially termed their sea country.
And that isn't just a cultural designation, right? It's a highly specific operational environmental knowledge base.
It's an unparalleled operational asset. These rangers, they understand the intricate mechanics of their local environment better than anyone.
Hmm.
They know the precise timing of the tides, the subtle seasonal shifts between the wet and dry monsoons, the exact location of hidden reef structures, and the baseline patterns of the local ecology.
So they know what normal looks like.
Exactly. Because their baseline knowledge is so absolute, they are acutely sensitive to any environmental anomalies.
They notice the signal in the noise.
Yes, they might not spot the boat on a radar screen, but they will identify, say, unfamiliar wood debris washed up in a mangrove system.
Oh, wow.
Or they'll note that a specific flock of coastal birds has been disturbed in a highly unusual pattern. Or they'll find footprints in a tidal zone that shouldn't have any human traffic whatsoever.
That's incredible.
They read the physical environment with a resolution that billion-dollar satellites simply cannot match.
Put yourself in the shoes of a cattle rancher or an indigenous ranger for a second. You're out doing your daily work in total isolation, and suddenly you are the first responder to an international maritime and humanitarian crisis. It turns local geography into an accidental pillar of national migration policy.
That's a great way to put it.
But let's look at the reality of that interaction on the ground. A ranger or a station worker discovers a vessel. The people on board have just spent 2 weeks on a top-heavy wooden boat with a dying engine crossing a hostile ocean. When they finally make landfall, they aren't exactly disembarking ready for a customs interview.
No, not at all. The immediate aftermath of a landing is almost universally a severe humanitarian crisis.
Right.
The passengers are typically suffering from acute dehydration, starvation, severe exposure, and very often trauma or injuries sustained during the crossing itself. The local residents who discover them are thrust instantly into a triage situation.
They have to stabilize them before they can even think about the geopolitics or the legality of the situation.
Exactly. The sources indicate that the immediate response is always driven by the humanitarian imperative. Rangers or station workers provide emergency fresh water, basic first aid, and shelter from the elements.
Just basic human decency.
Yes. And it is only after that immediate existential crisis is managed that the official reporting chain is initiated, utilizing, satellite phones or high-frequency radios to contact the Australian Border Force National Maritime Center or the regional police commands.
It's such a surreal dynamic. You have global migration policy ultimately resting on the shoulders of a solitary cattle rancher or an indigenous ranger providing a bottle of water on a completely empty beach.
It really highlights the human element in all of this.
It does. But from the smuggler's perspective, this is a terrible operational model, right?
Right.
Relying on your passengers surviving the Timor Sea, only to hopefully be found by a random rancher before they die of exposure on an empty beach that is not sustainable for a business. The syndicates needed to compress the timeline.
Right, they needed a geographic shortcut.
And they found one. This is where the geography of the Indian Ocean provided a massive, exploitable loophole, centering on a location called Ashmore Reef.
Ah, yes. Ashmore Reef and Cartier Island.
Let's map this out for you, the listener, because the coordinates here are the entire key to the strategy.
So Ashmore Reef is an external territory of Australia. It is a highly sensitive marine environment consisting mostly of just coral reefs and small, completely uninhabited sand cays.
Just sandbars, basically.
Yeah. It has no permanent infrastructure, absolutely no fresh water, and no civilian population. Geographically, it is situated approximately 600 kilometers off the coast of Western Australia.
So it is way out in the Indian Ocean, but the critical metric here isn't its distance from Australia, is it? It's the distance from Indonesia.
Precisely. Ashmore Reef is only about 320 kilometers south of the Indonesian archipelago.
So it is practically twice as close to the smugglers' departure points as it is to the Australian mainland.
And that geographic reality completely altered the smugglers' calculus. Navigating an unseaworthy SAV all the way to the Kimberley coast or Darwin requires surviving 600 to 800 kilometers of open ocean.
Which we know is a coin toss on those boats.
Exactly. But the goal is simply to reach Australian sovereign territory. Ashmore Reef cuts that journey in half.
It drastically reduces the fuel requirements, the exposure to monsoonal weather, and crucially, the time window for ABF detection. So it was essentially a geographic cheat code. The smugglers found a piece of Australia that was physically closer to Indonesia than to the Australian mainland, effectively shrinking the ocean they had to cross.
That is exactly what it was. The sources describe Ashmore Reef functioning historically as a kind of navigational beacon or a waypoint for these syndicates. Because, under the interpretation of the Australian Migration Act at the time, Ashmore Reef was fully integrated into the Australian migration zone.
Meaning what, exactly?
It meant that the moment a vessel crossed into the territorial waters of the reef, or a passenger physically set foot on the sand quay, they had, legally speaking, arrived in Australia.
Wow. So the physical reality of being on a barren sandbar in the middle of the ocean was superseded by the legal reality that they were, for all statutory purposes, standing on Australian soil.
Yes. And for the syndicates, it was a total victory. They'd fulfilled their contract, they'd delivered the passengers to a zone that triggered the legal mechanisms allowing those arrivals to claim asylum and seek protection visas under Australian law.
Unbelievable.
The reef essentially became a maritime taxi rank, facilitating a massive surge in arrivals because the risk profile for the smugglers just plummeted.
I imagine the political and legal infrastructure back in Canberra went into absolute meltdown over this. I mean, the geography essentially provided a loophole to bypass the physical defense of the entire continent. And if you can't move the reef further away from Indonesia, which you can't, and you can't build a wall around a submerged coral ecosystem, how does the government respond to that?
They respond by attacking the legal framework itself. This situation at Ashmore Reef became a primary catalyst for intense political and legislative maneuvers in the early 2000s, leading to policies that fundamentally questioned the very nature of sovereignty and borders.
Because if the physical geography favored the smugglers, the government just decided to rewrite the legal geography.
Exactly.
Which leads us to this concept of excision. And I want to dig really deep into the mechanics of this because it is a fascinating, almost bizarre piece of legal engineering. In 2001, the Australian Parliament passed legislation that literally excised or removed Ashmore Reef, Cardia Island, and eventually other offshore territories from the Australian Migration Zone.
Right. This was the Migration Amendment Excision from Migration Zone Act of 2001. And the concept, as you said, is conceptually jarring.
Yeah.
To excise means to surgically remove.
Yeah.
But they didn't cede sovereignty. Ashmore Reef remained 100% Australian territory.
Right. It's still Australia on a map.
Exactly. The Australian military still defended it, and Australian environmental laws still governed it.
But they essentially created this kind of quantum superposition of territory. Like, it is Australia, but for the specific purposes of the Migration Act, it is not Australia.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The legislation created a dual reality. The government dictated that arriving at these specific, geographically excised coordinates no longer conferred the statutory right to apply for a visa.
Okay, so if you landed at a non-excised port, like Sydney Harbor, the standard legal pathways just opened up as usual.
Right. But if you landed at Ashmore Reef, you were categorized entirely differently. This category was specifically designed to prevent you from accessing the mainland legal system.
It is the ultimate administrative gerrymandering. You just change the borders of the legal reality without moving a single grain of sand. But the excision was really just the first move in this legal chess match, wasn't it? The source material details an even more aggressive maneuver by the government, the attempt to declare the lagoon at Ashmore Reef a proclaimed port.
Yes. This is arguably the most complex and contested legal fiction we are discussing today.
Okay, let's unpack it.
So, excision removed the right to apply for a visa upon arrival. But the government still needed a mechanism to process these intercepted vessels and legally transport the passengers to offshore detention facilities on Nauru or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, rather than bringing them to the Australian mainland.
Because if you bring them to the mainland, even just for processing, they have physically entered the non-excised zone, and that legal firewall you just built completely collapses.
Correct. You let them in. So to facilitate this transfer without bringing them to the mainland, the government utilized provisions originally rooted in biosecurity and customs frameworks. Mind you, to officially declare the lagoon at Ashmore Reef a port.
A port.
A lagoon. Yes. The operational strategy was to intercept the ASEVs in international or territorial waters, physically tow the wooden boats into the lagoon at Ashmore Reef, and process the individuals right there.
But by towing them into this designated, air quotes, port, what did that actually legally achieve?
It allowed the authorities to officially categorize the individuals on board as offshore entry persons. This is a highly specific statutory definition. Once you were legally classified as an offshore entry person who had arrived at a proclaimed port, the law explicitly empowered the government to forcibly transfer you to a regional processing country like Nauru without ever granting you access to the Australian mainland or its domestic courts.
So they basically conjured a port out of thin air to act as a legal processing checkpoint. They needed a port to make the paperwork function, so they looked at a coral reef and said, all right, that is a port. But legally, statutorily, doesn't a word have to mean something? You can't point to a bicycle and legally declare it an airplane just to bypass traffic laws.
Exactly. And that tension between administrative declaration and physical reality is exactly what triggered a massive legal reckoning. The government kind of relied on the assumption that an executive declaration was sufficient. But the Australian judicial system eventually had to interrogate the physical reality of Ashmore Reef against the statutory definition of a port.
Right.
This culminated in a landmark 2018 federal court ruling.
Okay, let's break down that 2018 ruling for a minute because the sources point to it as a massive unraveling of this entire strategy. The case is often referred to by its legal pseudonym, DBE 17 v. Minister for Home Affairs. What was the core argument there?
The absolute core of the case was whether the government's declaration of Ashmore Reef as a port was legally valid. The lawyers for the asylum seekers argued that a port, as understood in common law and statutory context, it requires specific functional characteristics.
Like actual things a port has.
Yes, it requires infrastructure to facilitate the loading and unloading of cargo or passengers. It requires a harbor master, navigational aids, and, some semblance of commercial or administrative utility.
And Ashmore Reef has none of that. It is a submerged coral ecosystem that is entirely underwater at high tide, save for a few little sand cays.
And the federal court agreed. The court ruled that the government's attempt to designate the lagoon as a port was fundamentally invalid. The judges looked at the physical evidence, the lack of docks, the lack of infrastructure, the fact that it was literally an environmental reserve, and they concluded that an executive declaration cannot override the plain meaning and functional reality of a word.
Wow.
You cannot simply define a natural marine feature as a port just to satisfy a procedural requirement in the Migration Act.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's like playing a board game where touching a specific square means you win. So the player running the game just rewrites the rulebook mid-game, declaring that square no longer exists on the board. And then years later, a referee steps in and says, you can't do that. It's a surreal collision of physical reality and legal fiction. The judicial branch stepped in and said the legal fiction collapsed under the weight of physical reality.
It really did.
But the fallout from that ruling must have been catastrophic for the government's administrative architecture. I mean, what happens to all the people who are already processed through that fake port?
The retroactive implications were massive. Because the proclamation of the port was ruled legally void, it meant that the legal mechanism used to categorize over 1,000 asylum seekers as offshore entry persons was also void.
Wait, really? Because their entire legal classification was predicated on arriving at a port that the court just decided never actually existed.
Exactly. It forced a massive, incredibly complex revisiting of the legal status of those individuals. If they weren't legally offshore entry persons, the government's authority to transfer them to or keep them in offshore detention centers like Nauru was thrown into intense legal jeopardy.
That is wild.
It demonstrated the extreme fragility of building migration policy on aggressive legal fictions. When the fiction collapses, the entire operational structure goes down with it.
Which brings us to the modern paradigm. The geographical shortcut of Ashmore Reef has been legally neutralized by the courts, and the excision policy fundamentally changed the nature of arrival. So how does Australia manage this 1,000-kilometer problem today, given the total failure of the proclaimed port strategy?
Well, the current overarching framework, as detailed in the source material, is Operation Sovereign Borders,
Right.
which represents a highly militarized, deterrence-based approach to border management. The philosophy has shifted entirely away from complex onshore legal categorizations toward absolute maritime denial. The core pillars of this are detect, intercept, and deter.
So rather than letting them reach the reef and then arguing in court about what the reef legally is, you just stop them before they even see the reef. You push the border out into the ocean.
That is the operational mandate now. The Australian Border Force, heavily supported by the Royal Australian Navy, maintains a persistent, highly aggressive force posture in the waters between Indonesia and Northern Australia.
So it's heavily militarized.
Yes. This involves constant naval patrols, advanced aerial surveillance, and a mandate to physically intercept SCEs in international or contiguous waters.
And what actually happens upon interception? Because if the goal is absolute denial, they obviously aren't towing them to Ashmore Reef anymore.
No, absolutely not. Ashmore Reef's role has reverted to its actual physical reality. It is a heavily patrolled, highly restricted environmental marine reserve. It is explicitly monitored now to ensure it cannot be utilized as a staging ground or a destination.
Okay, so where do they go?
When a vessel is intercepted today, the policy heavily favors what are called turnbacks or takebacks.
Meaning they physically turn the boat around.
Yes. If it's deemed safe to do so, authorities will intercept the vessel and basically compel it to return to its point of departure, which is most often Indonesia.
But wait, if the original vessel is unseaworthy, which, as we discussed earlier, is almost always the case, how is it safe to turn them back?
That's a critical point. Authorities have utilized specialized, basically unsinkable lifeboats to transfer the passengers and return them to Indonesian waters safely.
Oh, I see.
If a turnback is not operationally feasible for whatever reason, the individuals are processed for offshore regional transfer. The absolute, unyielding objective of the policy is to guarantee that no irregular maritime arrival results in settlement on the Australian mainland.
So the deterrence is the point. The government is essentially attempting to completely shatter the economic model of the smuggling syndicates by mathematically guaranteeing a 100% failure rate for the product they are selling, which is settlement in Australia.
That is the stated strategic logic. By utilizing overwhelming maritime force and maintaining strict offshore processing protocols, the policy aims to signal to both the syndicates and the potential passengers that the perilous journey across the Timor Sea will never, ever result in the desired outcome, thereby neutralizing the demand.
It is an incredible evolution of policy driven entirely by this intense friction between geography and law. I mean, we started this deep dive looking at a physical map Kuri Bay to Port Essington, the cliffs, the 11-meter tides, the sheer isolation of it all.
Yeah.
We examined the brutal physics of the SCVs, where human lives are literally balanced against the metacentric height of a rotting wooden boat. We saw how the immense scale of the environment forces local cattle ranchers and indigenous rangers to act as the ultimate fail-safes in an international surveillance net.
And we traced how that physical reality forced the government to stretch the boundaries of the law, creating surreal legal fictions like excising sovereign territory from its own statutes and attempting to redefine a coral reef as a functional port, only to have the courts tear that fiction down.
It's a testament to how incredibly complex human migration becomes when it collides with extreme geography, and it really leaves us with a profound concept to consider. We've seen how a state, when challenged by its own physical borders, attempted to redefine the nature of a place, literally stripping a physical island of its legal status to manage the flow of people.
It's a powerful precedent.
It is. So, as border enforcement technologies become more pervasive, and as the pressures of global migration continue to compound, it forces us to ask a larger question about the future of the nation-state. Will we see more of our physical world excised from legal reality? If a government can decide that a reef is no longer part of its migration zone, when does a piece of sovereign land cease to be a country and simply become an abstract, legally void buffer zone? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon to unpack another complex topic. Until then, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.